Welcome to the Hodja on Architecture podcast. The Origins of Architecture, Chapter 2, When Humans Began to Stay. In the previous chapter, we explored how architecture did not begin with monuments or formal buildings, but with humanity's earliest attempts to intentionally transform environments. We examined how shelters gradually evolved from biological necessities into cultural conditions, and how spatial awareness emerged long before architecture became a recognized discipline. In this chapter, we move from temporary occupation to permanent settlement. The central question is no longer how humans protected themselves within space, but why they eventually chose to remain in one place. For most of human history, mobility was not an exception, but the normal condition of existence. Early human groups moved continuously in response to climate, animals, seasonal resources, and environmental uncertainty. Space, during this period, was experienced not as permanence but as transition. Camps appeared briefly and then disappeared, leaving only limited traces of occupation. Human survival depended less on controlling territory than on understanding movement through landscapes. This mobility shaped not only survival strategies but also social organization itself. Knowledge was connected to routes, seasons, migration patterns, and temporary environmental opportunities. Settlements, in the modern sense, did not yet exist because permanence carried risks as much as advantages. Remaining in one location could exhaust nearby resources, increase vulnerability to environmental change, or create conflict over territory. Movement therefore functioned as a form of adaptation. At the same time, however, mobility also imposed limitations. Temporary occupation restricted storage, accumulation, and long-term spatial organization. Objects had to remain portable, shelters had to remain flexible, and social structures often depended on constant environmental responsiveness. Under such conditions, architecture could emerge only in relatively temporary forms because permanence itself remained unstable. The transition towards settlement did not occur suddenly, nor did a single event cause it. Instead, it emerged gradually through environmental familiarity and repeated occupation. Certain locations began to attract continuous returns because they offered strategic advantages such as access to water, fertile land, defensive positions, or reliable food sources. Over time, repetition slowly transformed temporary camps into semi-permanent environments. This transformation altered humanity's relationship with time itself. Mobility prioritized immediate adaptation, whereas settlement encouraged continuity, planning, and anticipation. Once humans began to remain in one place for extended periods, they also began investing labor in the long-term modification of environments. Construction no longer served only immediate survival, but increasingly addressed future needs. Space became something capable of persistence across generations. This shift also changed the meaning of territory. Earlier forms of occupation were often fluid, temporary, and movement-oriented. Settlement, however, introduced stronger distinctions between inside and outside, belonging and exclusion, familiar and unfamiliar territory. Space gradually acquired social boundaries alongside physical ones. Architecture, therefore, became connected not only to shelter, but also to identity and collective organization. At this stage, the relationship between settlement and memory becomes particularly important. Temporary occupation leaves limited spatial continuity because environments are repeatedly abandoned and reoccupied elsewhere. Permanent settlement, however, allows experiences, routines, and symbolic meanings to accumulate within specific locations. Space begins to function not merely as protection from the environment, but as a container of social memory. This accumulation of memory transforms architecture into something more than environmental adaptation. Hearths remain in consistent locations, pathways become repeated patterns of movement, and certain areas acquire ritual or communal significance. The settlement gradually develops an internal structure shaped by habit and repetition. Human life becomes spatially organized not only physically, but culturally. Settlement also changes the relationship between humans and labor. Temporary camps often prioritize speed, flexibility, and minimal construction effort. Permanent environments, however, justify larger investments of time, energy, and material organization. Walls become thicker, storage spaces emerge, and spatial arrangements become increasingly deliberate. Construction begins to anticipate continuity rather than immediate abandonment. This continuity contributes directly to the emergence of architectural thinking. Once environments are expected to persist, decisions about orientation, material use, circulation, and organization become more important. Space is no longer occupied, it is managed, maintained, and developed over time. Architecture, therefore, becomes increasingly tied to planning rather than immediate reaction. At the same time, settlement introduces entirely new forms of vulnerability. Remaining in one place increases dependence on local environmental conditions and creates greater exposure to drought, disease, resource depletion, and territorial conflict. Permanence, therefore, does not eliminate uncertainty, it reorganizes it. Settled life produces stability in some areas, while simultaneously generating new risks in others. This tension reveals that settlement should not be understood as a simple narrative of progress. The movement from mobility to permanence was neither universally positive nor historically inevitable. Rather, it represented a profound reorganization of human relationships with environment, labor, community, and time. Architecture emerged within this transformation not as decoration, but as an active framework for organizing increasingly complex forms of life. The emergence of settlement also changes the scale of collective interaction. Temporary groups often remain relatively fluid, whereas permanent settlements encourage denser and more continuous forms of social contact. Shared spaces become increasingly necessary because daily life now depends on sustained cooperation. Storage, food preparation, protection, and ritual activities begin to require more structured forms of spatial organization. As settlements expand, architecture gradually moves beyond isolated shelters toward interconnected environments. Individual structures become linked through circulation routes, gathering areas, and shared activity zones. The settlement begins to function not merely as a collection of buildings, but as a spatial system. This represents one of the earliest foundations of organized community life. Such developments also contribute to the emergence of social hierarchy and differentiated spatial roles. Certain spaces become associated with authority, ritual, storage, production, or communal gathering. Space begins reflecting social organization more visibly, and architecture increasingly mediates relationships between individuals and the collective. Settlement, therefore, transforms architecture into both a physical and social structure. This process also marks a deeper psychological transformation. Mobility encourages adaptability and environmental responsiveness, whereas permanence encourages attachment to place. Humans begin identifying themselves through continuity with specific environments rather than through movement alone. The settlement becomes more than a survival mechanism. It becomes part of collective identity. Once humans began staying, architecture acquired an entirely different temporal dimension. Buildings were no longer expected merely to protect the present moment, but also to support future continuity. Construction began carrying memory forward across generations. In this sense, settlement transformed architecture from temporary adaptation into long-term spatial inheritance. In the next chapter, we will examine how the emergence of agriculture gradually transformed human relationships with production, storage, and time itself. The discussion will shift from permanence to cultivation, from movement through landscapes to land management, and from temporary survival to long-term environmental control. Because once humans began staying in one place, the next transformation became inevitable, learning not only how to inhabit environments, but how to reshape them systematically through cultivation. This concludes Chapter 2 of The Origins of Architecture, When Humans Began to Stay. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.